Firstly, welcome everyone to our weekly colloquium session. Thank you all for joining us, everyone here in person and everyone online. Today, we're very happy to have Saliem Fakir here with us. He is the founder and executive director of the African Climate Foundation, which is a strategic grant-making foundation which supports interventions at the nexus of climate and development. It's quite fascinating. Saliem's expertise lies in climate, geopolitics, and finance economics. And today he's going to speak to us about South Africa's just transition and its ramifications for Africa. So thank you very much, Saliem, and sure. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and for also greetings to the people online. It's we've got used to this over the last 2 years, so it's become a norm. But also to thank CST for inviting me to just share a few insights on the just transition, not only in South Africa, but some challenges that we have going forward on the rest of the continent. I don't want to be long because I think I would rather afford more time for the discussion, and I might not talk about the JETP entirely, so I might want to just raise a couple of challenges around transitions in general, and then maybe home in specifically on what that picture looks like in South Africa, Nigeria, elsewhere. But given that a new foundation, the African Climate Foundation, has been established in April 2020, so it's very recent. We are what in the philanthropic space is called re-granters, and we are invested in by the larger endowment, global endowment. Interestingly, also some endowments starting to get involved from within the continent itself, so entirely reliant on overseas philanthropy. Our mission is really to operate across the continent, and we can't operate in 54 countries, but we have selected several countries, strategic and important in different sub-regions and the economies of those regions. I would say that our big shift in narrative is to really move away from a negative narrative around climate to a more constructive engagement around the issue, which we want to try to mainstream as an economic issue, not just some discussion that has historically been very much driven by sort of a strong environmental lens, not to underplay that, but very little focus on the real economy issues that are vital. And in Africa, it has taken a particular reading as well. I would go as far as saying that it's been a narrative developed by a certain logic of aid community, which is informed by humanitarian crisis-oriented thinking. So particularly adaptation and resilience. And so the debates around actual real economy issues around energy transition, urban transitions, and economic transformation have not surfaced into the debate. And this particular issue has been sort of cornered by both special interest figures that are negotiating and also environmental groups that have tended to focus it in a very narrow way, what I would call single issue proponents, who have sort of, in my view, have lost the broader picture. Mm-hmm. And I think because they've lost the broader picture, they have not been able to articulate, other than rhetorically, what the alternative should be, without actually demonstrating they have the capacity and the coalition, political or otherwise, to actually transform what are real issues in Africa, which is around economic transformation. It's not just about the environmental side. If we if you want, theoretically want to move up the Kuznets curve and be able to raise the levels of income that you can actually invest in real adaptation and resilience from your own internal resources, you've got to think about economic development, economic growth, distributional effects of that growth. So I think this is the premises for the just transition. Often the just transition is seen as a knock-on effect of coal phase out, oil phase out, but actually, in my view, just transition is a question about the broader structural economic transformation issues. And if we don't locate it within that, this issue of the JETP, the South African JETP, the just transition itself, is just a very narrow, confined conversation. And I don't think you can solve both the problem of decarbonization, combined with energy security and energy access, and also the just aspect, without a debate about the broader economic question, including the political systems that govern over it, the problem of special interest in the economy, and often the lack of democratization of the debate itself. So we have a presence in Senegal, Kenya, Nigeria, also work in Namibia at the moment. And our three focus areas are urban, energy, land use, and agriculture. But our thesis is around driving economic change, encouraging new kinds of investment, but with a very strong focus on the political economy, the distributional effects of the political economy. I want to say some philosophical aspects that I think we all have to think about when we think about just energy transition partnerships and energy transitions elsewhere. We have to ask ourselves what can an imagined ecological civilization look like? What are the conditions for that? It's not. I know the Chinese have ecological civilization, but it's a question that I think we all have to ask. The philosopher Timothy Morton has put a challenge for us. He calls climate a hyper-object. It's an object so large, huge, contributed by the Anthropocene age. And I think what he says is that it's so big, but it lives with us, yet we have to maybe give ourselves the illusion that we can solve it. And, it's a bit like other type of hyper objects, meteorites landing on Earth, a nuclear bomb going off. Although he puts that philosophical challenge before us, it does raise a question: is the ecological civilization possible? If we have to live with a hyper object that has been the result of our creation, but yet so beyond our reach to control now, is there merit in everything we do? And I would say that I'm sort of an optimist. But I thought I'd put that there because I think it's a reference for building to think about how we do these things in a way that is realistic, not utopian, but grounded, but also reminding ourselves that there is a hyper object, and maybe we can't solve it, even though we like to tell ourselves we can solve it. And I think his second related reference point is it something we have to live with and adapt to, which is a question not just about the very narrow idea of adaptation and resilience, but organization of politics, the economy, also the way we organize in society to be able to deal with this. So even if we make our interventions, we can't foretell the cascade effects, whether they're going to go in the wrong direction or the right direction. We like to believe when we solve climate issues, we will always go in the right direction. But that's a story we tell ourselves. It's a story we tell to other people who have to buy into our vision. But the truth is that it might not go the way we think it should. I think, given that you guys work complexity, there is generally in the space, certainly when I joined the philanthropic space, the resolution of a climate issue. There was in fact a motto in one of the philanthropies, the idea of design to win, which meant it was a primary focus that if you just plugged a lot of technology and put a lot of money into something, the problem will be solved. I think you guys are complexity theorists, you know that lots of things, chaos can happen also as a result of that. So I want to raise about 6 points for us to think about when we entering the transition debate, not only in South Africa but the rest of the continent. We have to be aware, and this is the point that I made about realism and not living utopia and understanding what we are grappling with. Also in this late hour of the ecological civilization. We should have been doing this when the evidence was not clear. But there are 6 tensions that I think we're going to have to navigate, which is true for all kinds of transitions, not just climate. The problem of path dependency. We have over the 150 years invested in a particular model of energy solutions, and we are expecting to try to make that transition the next decade, literally next decade. And we're bound to face many sources of friction and multiple unanticipated crises. For example, the EU just came out in the COVID period with the European Green Deal, Fit for 55, really great idea. The Russian war happened. Now they're dealing with no gas, price hikes, and also price gouging by companies that are able to monopolize the crisis. So these are sources of friction. But yet we have to shift from path dependency. In South Africa, it's a shift from coal, huge vested interests. Remember, lots of coal interests have moved into new hands, and those parties that own those assets and those interests are not just going to give it up overnight. Technology can be neutral and non-neutral. I like to say that not all technology necessarily has to be a bad thing, but it also has non-neutrality as a dimension to it, because it depends the nature of the technology. If it's a large-scale public technology push, it could benefit the broader society. It depends on how the capacity of people will use electricity, whether they have the right income levels to be able to benefit from that. But if you were to decentralize the technology in a very unequal society, the non-neutrality of the technology becomes very clear. So, for example, people shifting off-grid, defecting because the state utility is not performing. Richer people are going to vacate, like they're doing in many things, health, education. The burden on the distributional burden then falls largely on the state, but the benefit, the ability to cross-subsidize poorer households will be affected. New investments create new streams of finance and catalyze new kinds of profits. Okay? The compensation from, because this is a challenge I always have to climate activists. You want this, but you don't talk about how the current structure of the economy is going to tilt and orientate the benefit to those players that have expertise, finance, organizational capability, and lobbying power to extract from that, and likely to be running off with like it's happening with wind companies and solar companies in Europe at the moment, reaping windfall benefits because for some odd reason electricity prices in Europe are pegged to the gas price. So the European government wants to claw back those benefits. The decarbonization is an uncharted territory, particularly for emerging economies. There are many trade-offs. And the way we deal with those trade-offs is highly dependent on good political leadership, ability to build consensus in society. It touches on lots of things you're doing, Cedric, and being very visionary on the future and how we navigate trade-offs, because they're not easy. People underestimate the importance of that social and organizational and political infrastructure to be able to deal with trade-offs. Again, climate activists don't think about this. They think about single issue, get us off emissions, but we don't think of how we build the capacity to manage trade-offs. That's really, really crucial. Finance is available at the right fair price, but beware of the power of the financial sector. It's a big political economy globally. There was a Swiss university did an analysis of who controls the largest share of the banking and private equity sector. It's a handful of companies and interests. So beware of the rent seeking and financialization. I don't know if you remember the famous Keynesian comment. To deal with rent seeking, you must euthanize the rent seekers. This is what Keynes said, but he meant it in a metaphorical way. Go and kill them. He was pointing us, like Adam Smith did, pointing us to the self-interest of parties, and they will use their power to perpetuate. We see some of that debate in ESG debates, net zero debates, etc. I don't think Keynes really meant euthanize in the strict sentiment. So if we want to flesh out the idea of ecological civilization, make my final comments, we have to think about reorganizing politics, governance over the terrain of distribution. Because we don't deal with that, can get increased inequality. Who controls this process of transition? That's a debate in South Africa. Is it the public or private community? And just transition does depend on the power of the order, the level of democratization, political organization. To do that, this morning I was in another talk. I was saying that the just transition is not the purview of a narrow group of people that are only interested in the climate solution. Actually, it's a broader debate because it's an economy-wide debate. And we have to find ways to democratize that. Otherwise, even the definition of who civil society is open to question. Is it the suburban elite that are very professional, that control access to funding and the microphones and the megaphones outside of the country? Or is it a broader constituencies that are affected people on the ground? I thought I'll leave it there. Might have been provocative enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saliem. That was a really interesting, very concise run through of the presentation. If there are any questions here, comments, anyone online, you're welcome to type out your question in the chat or to raise your hand and raise it in here. But while we wait, is there anyone here who has a question, comments?
Maybe I can start and just to say that I think one of our challenges is that we our academic disciplines are in silos, our ministries are in silos, our international organizations are in silos. So practically, how do we bring these different disciplines, stakeholders together? That's something you do in the foundation, but I mean, what would your advice be in terms of working towards a just transition? How do we actually practically bring those people and different knowledge arenas in order to have this kind of holistic view of what we need to discount?
No, it's a good question. We'll take two more then.
That sounds good. Yeah, to Kevin, and then Nina.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to jump on the silos story as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if one of the barriers that you're flagging up, and I think it seems to me quite often to be a barrier, at least in the South African case, is the role of sort of public budgeting and perhaps accounting for public budgets and how they're audited, and a barrier that they create, particularly for the silo working arrangements and barriers to innovation, I suppose, but also the way we then create narratives around the politics of allocating resources and effectively allocating resources. And I don't know if that features anywhere in your thinking.
Yeah, Nina.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be there today. And thanks, Saliem, for your talk. Very provocative and really touching on things that I'm also very interested in. I'm very struck by your point about building capacity to manage trade-offs. You know, we have in sustainability studies, we have very many theoretical frameworks, multi-level perspectives, political settlements theory, relational governance theory. And I'm always so struck by how we grapple with these frameworks, and at the end of the day, we are people in a room somewhere who need an integrity of process, a craftful facilitation, to understand the interests at play and to actually balance out and to find the commonality of interests in trade-offs. Yeah, so I'm really struck by how sustainability attempts to present tools and options, but I'm very struck by how the quality of how we gather and how we work it out is really, really important. And I think I begin to see some of that happening in the just transition discussion in South Africa, albeit not as broad as hoped for. But I think it's a discussion that is becoming more inclusive and gaining more momentum. So yeah, I'm just really struck by your appreciation of that, and also I would like to know how you see a reorganization of politics. If you could be maybe a little bit more explicit about what that looks like for you, that would be great. Thank you so much, Saliem. Very, very wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Nina.
Kevin, do you still have a question, or is that an old hand?
Oh,
Sorry, old hand.
okay. Let me try to share some perspectives. I think one of the things of the JETP, which was an inadvertent consequence of it, is that you got this whole structural injection of 8.5 billion into smack bang in the middle of a system. And I think the benefit of it is that it allows people to organize around what I would say Mazakuta talks about, which is like a mission-oriented initiative, transformative, large-scale. We don't know where it's going to go. It could also bang or completely become a disaster with lots of unintended consequences. But I see that as a way of also, it's rallying a lot of people. So what we've done, because we support a lot of this work, we consciously try to figure out a way to to build a very robust, dynamic ecosystem of players. And we tend to try to not only focus on one particular ideological group, but really about this common belief that we actually have to get out of the rut of codependency. The institutional framework of that codependency is built around one single utility, and then trying to create an investment momentum, which is real economy, but also locking the discussions around policy reform, fiscal support, the budget issue that you mentioned, Kevin, and also the just aspects of it. This is what I see visible happening in this process. And I think Nina just mentioned that. So I think that's the reality of the whole Glasgow outcome of the negotiations around the JETP. It's the hidden thing that is driving this. And because it's an international play with a domestic sovereign play, it will be embarrassing for the parties not to abandon this. Okay? They have to make it work in an imperfect world, right? With lots of dysfunctional state capacity and so on. And in fact, we are also looking at innovating in the institutional models to deliver this once the negotiations around the funding has been resolved by COP27. So we have to think about the institutional capability and how do we deliver this at, both at the national level within the state utility, which has its own set of problems, and then on the ground. These are all things that. So what we're not waiting for is nirvana. We're not waiting for the perfect moment, which most leftists do. They wait for the perfect moment. They want everything to be resolved, classless society, and then things. I think we can wait for another 100 years before something like that. So we've got to try to do this. And we will make mistakes, by the way. It's not going to be a perfect. And we can't have a dreamlike view of it. But we do understand there's a strategic moment in history. Just got to shove this thing in there and be astute enough to try to figure out how to manage it and get the right kinds of political coalitions to support that. Something good will come out of it, or something bad. Can't tell you what it is. I'm just a complete realist of them. So I'm going to give you a rose-tinted view about that. But I don't think we have any option, to be honest. I actually don't think we have any option. I can't see that. On the reorganization of politics, I think you have to ask your question, the current stock of leadership, are they going to give us anything, even on the energy transitions? So I don't think, but I do believe you have to have some form of political power. The question is, who's behind it? That's the crucial question. And that would require, in my view, there's a lag in the fact that more grassroots, like we had in the apartheid era, we had lots of grassroots mass movements that built up a strong political coalition. We don't have that level of organization yet, and we are stuck with interests that we don't know who's behind them often and what the interests are. Rhetorically, they say stuff. When they get into power, they do some other stuff. So how do we balance that reality with ensuring the right outcomes? I don't know the answer to it, but I just want to point to the challenge.
And then Odie.
If I can just
And then followed by Nina.
follow up on what you said about the energy transition. I mean, don't we, in order to achieve the vision that you've spelled out, don't we need something like, I'm thinking back of the National Peace Accord, like some kind of a public national commitment to a vision, which can then publicly lock in various, from political parties to civil society to the private sector to other stakeholders, because that can then become something quite visual and could be something that could help other, as you were saying, the energy transition, the climate dimension is interlinked with our whole economy and with our political system. And maybe this could be a vehicle for social cohesion also in other sectors of our society if this becomes a center of gravity for a transformational process. But then it needs to, do you have a sense that it could have that kind of public dimension, or is this something mostly done in boardrooms out of public view?
No, I don't think it's done. You will say one more two?
So very early, we have a question.
It's a bit different, but I don't know if you know that point.
I think and then
Yeah, thanks for. Yeah, I got some of the presentation because it came late and sort of.
That's right.
But the bit that
I
I
have
thought,
recorded it.
the bit that I thought that interested me was, so you mentioned that it's not really a climate story; it's more than that. And so I wondered how this South African South African transition story in its fullness in a way, does it respond, and how does it respond to international transition events? Like you mentioned with what's happening now in Europe, does our story also react to that story, and in what way?
Nina?
Yeah,
Was your name? It was Amina Simone. No.
inspired by, yes, thanks to mom and dad. Yeah, I'm just also very always struck, especially in the dynamics in the JETP and this global economic system as you talk about it, that underlying our rates of development, our institutional maturity is a deep injustice between the North and South, and this very extreme and gross extraction, and that underlying efforts for financing is actually a question of justice, of global justice, not just national justice. And I understand how our institutions and our leadership dance around this issue for what you say. We can't really afford to fail. We have to push through with all of the compromises. But I just wonder if, like, who is the champion for that justice? Not just for South Africa, but for the region, for all global South. That have to undergo this transition. Like, when you talk about structural inequality, it is mainly the result of that gross extraction. All of our resources, energy, labor, soil, water, is invested in the North rather than reinvested for our own benefit. And I wonder if that's just my own like pipe dream obsession, but for fuck's sake, can we just call it, like, can we just say it? Can we mobilize around it? Can we bring some integrity to our negotiations and our demands? They are, yeah.
No, thank you. And maybe I'll start off with your question. There are two tensions that I see. I personally see that this is a broader economic issue. Certainly in the discussion we're having in Nigeria, Senegal, we are asking questions about oil dependency and economic transformation. In South Africa, it tends to be, although I think the Presidential Commission is trying to widen it, it tends to get gravitated because the voices that are strong tend to be people that come from sort of the climate space. And they have, in a sense, what we've had, maybe not as a result of intention, but as a result of the way it has been approached. The just transition debate can also be kind of parochialized as a climate issue. And in fact, it's not a climate issue, if you really were to look at it. So the danger of that is that you don't appeal to wider groups. I think there's a process on the go to try to do that. So I wouldn't say it's a, we've just done some analysis of social media. So we look at voices like climate activists. Largely, it's a small 5% of the audience is really interested in the issue. 80 to 85% of the audience is interested in, questions of bread and butter issues. Load shedding is an issue. Price of food, corruption. The disjuncture between what we are pushing and what's the interest of ordinary society is there's a big gap. But if you really look at it in the real terms, if this thing was about using the energy transition to also shift the debate around the nature of the economy, it can be a powerful view. But I'm not certain it's not certain we've got the right tools yet and the right people behind it. And we may be in the process to get there. But certainly not many of the political parties are actually talking about this. To really look at the speeches. Even within the ANC, it's largely the president, you've got other dysfunctional ministers who talk about other things. But there is cabinet support for this, but it's not communicated as a bold transitional transformation idea, even at the political level. It's seen as a deal add to the economic recovery plan. So it's not about a program to reorientate and reconfigure ecological impacts. I don't think we're there. And I don't think anywhere else in the world it is like that. Whether it should or should not be is a big question. And you talked about the debate interlocking with international transition debates. The South African transition debate is not isolated from. There's discussions in the G7, G20. I just came off a workshop now. Open discussion on India's transition. We've been asked to make an input there. The Indians are having a conversation about this, the Vietnamese and so on. There's a big program of work being run by the African Development Bank and others. But what we do know is there's a recognition that we've got to shift to decarbonize. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's trying to figure out how to do it. Managing their sovereign interests against the global interests. Those are the tensions they have to think about. The EU is in the throes of it now. Their sovereign interest as a bloc versus, them wanting to be leaders in the frontier of actually tackling climate change. These tensions are now playing themselves out with. I was on Fatan. She was on a call today, and there were GIZ persons asked, why is Africa dependent on gas? The person doesn't see the contradiction. This is a German institution person asking the Africans why we're still using gas. I don't know where the person lives. I mean, I just don't understand this. So this is the kind of stuff we have to deal with in the international debates. People live in their own bubbles. The reality is that Germany is doing completely the opposite of what they want the Africans to do. So this is the kind of paradox we have to deal with. On the global south, Nina, as a foundation, we are very active with counterparts in other parts of the world to look at strengthening Southern voices. And I don't mean in a rhetorical way as well, but really one of the interesting questions is, which is growing, is how to bring this debate about economic transformation issues into the discussion on climate, because that's not a very strong feature when you're dealing with groups outside of in North America and Europe and so on. Thanks.
Megan, I see you've made a comment. I don't know if you want to raise that in plenary.
Yes, thanks. It's just been fascinating to engage with people at very different levels of development finance institutions around trying to unpack well, firstly, the way that they see the distinction between a development finance institution and a commercial bank, which I think has been largely watered down if you look at the history of development finance over the last century. And then on top of that, to understand the DFI's role in the energy transition, and we've kind of periodized and tried to understand the different roles that DFIs have played in order to then ask, well, where does this development mandate come from? How does that play out in their understanding of social impact, socioeconomic contributions, development? And then to say, well, what does this mean for how you're understanding the just energy transition? And obviously the story of crisis, counter-cyclical investment, and the role of DFIs almost being a buttress against the fracturing of a status quo. So they've got this idea that DFIs have actually provided hegemonic stability to kind of bring back the economy to business as usual. Also is now also very rife in the way that they're thinking about development finance going forward and what that means for the just energy transition. And then it's just really say, how can you reimagine what those financial institutions see as their role, rather than just say bringing us back to business as usual, this idea of the lender of last resort in a period of crisis, but actually in Mazzucato's framing, this idea of a lender of first resort. And what does that mean for, and what does a just energy transition investment by a DFI look like inside that, let's say, 8.5 billion package? But I think there's so much work to be done in shifting those understandings and those framings inside very key actors' conceptions of what development is, conceptions of what justice is, what their level of agency is, and really seeing finance as a leverage point to do that. So yeah, it's been a process that we've been running with practitioners that are part of DFIs in the International Development Finance Club, and would be. Yeah, I think their finance needs to be much more considered in the way we try to push their understanding of things, rather than just saying the finance is there.
I think you raise a really interesting question about DFIs, and I think as people roll out the South African JETP, there's a realization that JETPs are new kinds of, it's a new game, right? But the sources of finance is still stuck in an old rule system. It's not adapted to how to align it to the new game. And there's a conflict between, so one is to try to get this on scale with the right kind of finance behind it. We call it fair finance. So largely, I would say it has to be grants or extremely concessional. It's not there to the level that I think is necessary. And the second part is that there is no, what I would have envisaged is a kind of pool facility. But what we're finding is that bilateral donors are pursuing their own interests, and they are definitely market-seeking initiatives to expand expansion of the commercialization of their own technologies. And the third level is that the influence of the private investors on transition finance is really to try to find ways to de-risk private money using public money. These are the tensions that are playing themselves out. If we were a rich, advanced economy, we might have been in a better position to use our monetary tools to try to do that, like the way Japan did when it went into the post-war period. It directed banks to invest in particular, particularly the commercial banks had to invest in certain kinds of development projects. Otherwise, they would not be protected by the lender of last resort, if you want. So there are merits in that. You can read the way the Chinese actually also use the monetary policy instruments to influence the kind of development model that they've had, like restricting domestic savings from going offshore, actually penalizing domestic saving in order to generate a development dividend and not giving them not enabling them to be able to invest in instruments where they would have the higher return on their savings. That's what China. So this is a broader issue about the political economy of finance as a whole, both public and private. I'm not sure you can solve it with the way the current power of finance works globally.
I think to link it to that more of global finance remark of yours, I think the comment you made earlier that there's this kind of overarching narrative of I think I just came from a conference where we were discussing collapse,
Right.
hugely funded by private donors in New York and Denmark that want to feel they want to feed back or pay back some kind of debt to society and change all their funding applications and focus to solve the collapse or prepare people for collapse. You said also something earlier that there's this idea in the kind of funding community that if you throw enough money at problems, you can change this around. What is from your experience, if you say that you're channeling money or that, how do you, if you give advice to funders, or, private.
I'm not sure I will be able to give advice to funders.
It's like, what would you want them to fund? I mean, what is worth funding for? Is it just kind of on the ground projects, or is it large infrastructure? I mean, where is there? What kind of? How can we speak back to our funders also? Because we also work with a lot of funders. What is useful to fund, and what is in that sense?
I think private finance in economies like ours and so on are not going to be led by themselves. They almost they're going to look for higher returns, and Africa is right for that because there's generally more internal rates of returns that they can achieve because of they can impose a higher cost of capital on the finance that they provide. This is true for every kilowatt of renewables generated in the economy. If you compare it with peers like Southeast Asia and so on, our kilowatt hour generation is still higher because of the finance cost. So the renewables project is 90% of it is the finance cost. Okay, so if you deal with immature markets where the capacity of the state to be able to participate in that market is limited, it's an open season for private finance because you need the stuff. We'll sell it to you at the price we will determine, not the price you want. So that's it's like any good. You need the stuff. You don't have it. You don't have your own capacity to generate it, but you're desperate for it. We'll sell it to you at a very high profit that we cannot do elsewhere. Okay? This is the lay of the land. In South Africa, it might be different, but I'm of the belief that if you set the policy framework right, you set the regulation right, and you incentivize, you orientate the public finance in a particular way, then you can sort of manage the input of private finance if you are highly dependent on private finance without huge public resources. You must be able to manage that political economy. You can only do that if you have strong institutions of political leadership, and you should try to think about it. And I think those are mechanisms we can apply if we don't control the private finance. I think Mark is there from the DBSA. I think he wants us. It's from the DBSA.
I had one other question, if I may. Maybe also in the context of just transition thinking, that I noticed, for instance, Nigeria would argue that we've got liquefied gas, the cheapest thing for us in order to generate electricity for our people and stimulate development would be to use that. We want some kind of a exemption for the next 20 years. And I think India is maybe playing the same kind of role when it comes to coal, or at least wanting to safeguard their Is that something we see in South Africa around coal? I haven't really
It's the same. Gwede Matashi makes similar arguments. There's also hunting gas. You don't have domestic resource gas. You have to either get it from Mozambique or import it from somewhere else. But certainly in countries like Nigeria, Senegal, there's big lobbies now there. And even Algeria, they're pushing. But they have a couple of challenges. The one is those economies are not highly diversified. So they are, if you look at the structure of the Nigerian budget and so on, it's highly dependent on exports of oil and gas, particularly for budget support and budgets the government spend. There's very little trace of that goes into the rest of the economy. What goes on in the rest of the economy is really a spillover of income that's generated out of the oil and gas industry. So entrepreneurs are able to use that income benefit, but it's not a structured diversification by dint of accident and internal domestic entrepreneurship. It's not a deliberative transformation. So that's although rich people like Dangote and so on are trying to build fertilizer plants, also refineries. So Nigeria exports a lot of liquid fuels and imports a large amount of refined oil. So I think in the interim phase, you're going to have to use those commodified resources in order to build the alternative economy. There's no way of getting out of it for countries like Angola, even for that matter, Senegal. South Africa is a different story. We don't necessarily need a lot of gas, or we don't need any gas at all, actually. If we integrate it and build a very robust, diversified energy mix, that could be the cheapest source, and at this moment, it's renewables for sure. The question of whether they actually use those revenues to support electrification is a political one. The degree of democratization and ability of both the urban population and others, and also business interests in it to be able to persuade, put pressure on the political elite to spend in that direction. This is the question of political settlement that you have.
And I would say rather the opposite to Nigeria. If the elites know that they only have this oil revenue,
they might exploit
for the next 20 years. They'll take as much of it as they can. They're not going to use their revenue to provide electricity.
And you've hit the nail, because that's the fork in the road we are on, right? They can go this way, or they can be enlightened. Which is going to be the third or fourth largest population in the world in the next 20 years? 30 years is Nigeria. So Nigeria is literally a historical fork. The oil and gas are not going to last forever. No oil and gas will last forever. And so they have to think seriously about it. So I do think that we see some of that, like with the Dangote family and others, they are thinking about this. But maybe they don't have sufficient momentum to actually do that.
If there aren't any other questions online, in person, then I think we've reached the end of our hour, quite on time actually.
Thanks.
So thank you so much, Saliem, for.
You made me think about my own stuff. Very useful.
Thank you so much for sitting here with us today. Thank you, Cedric, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us. So
Thank you.
we'll be meeting here again next week. So see you all then.